everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Andy. I hope you're doing really well wherever or whenever in the world that you are. I know I'm a little bit late, so let's not waste any more time. We're gonna jump into my October wrap up. I'm gonna let you know about the 11 books that I read and the one DNF that I had from October. All right, the first book that I read in the month of October was The Yellow Wallpaper by someone's name who I'm forgetting. You'll see it on the screen. And this is a classic horror novella that follows a woman in the late 19th century, I think, as her mental health deteriorates without proper care. Now, this story is very short, but it is very eerie and very haunting. And I just remember feeling very agitated and like on edge as I was reading. Like the whole time I was like, is this husband gaslighting her? Like what is going on? What is real? What is not real? And so it's a trippy read. I will say, I think it's just from a genre that I don't love. So I ended up giving it a 3.5 stars. I think if you're looking for something short and spooky, it's a great Halloween time of year pick. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I loved that it was a quick read. I thought that the imagery throughout this little novella was so good. You really feel and hear and see things with this main character. Yeah, it was pretty spooky. I think if you like horror, I think you'll really enjoy this. The next book that I read was The Illegitimate Duke by Sophie Barnes, I think. And I jumped right into the middle of a companion novel series situation. I think this is book 3 of whatever the series is called. I really only picked this up because I saw another booktuber on Goodreads reading this series, so it piqued my interest and I picked it up. And this installment follows 2 characters, Juliet Matthews, this like high society lady who's looking to put her recent fortune to good use, and Florian Lowell, I think his name was, and he's the illegitimate duke who's also a physician. So they have to work together to fight this outbreak of typhus in their town. And I know that this book was written in 2018 and it's not about COVID, but it took me back to a place that I'm not itching to relive. So I think keep that in mind if you're thinking of picking this particular book up from the series. This series or this book, I feel like this might be one where you do want to read each individual book, because in this 3rd installment, there were lots of references to characters and events that I had no idea what they were talking about. So this might be one where you start from the beginning and make your way up. I ended up like understanding all the main points, but it was just something I noticed, especially at the beginning, that it did kind of bother me. From what I remember, Florian and Juliet, they do kind of have an instant attraction and like they're into each other pretty quickly, but then the progression through the book is more of like a friends to lovers situation. So I thought their chemistry and their relationship was paced really, really well. This book has the hero is taking care of the heroine scene, and I'm a sucker for that trope. I love when one character has to care for or, nurse the other partner back to health. I love it so much. Now, I will say the big bad secret for Florian like really didn't feel like a big deal to me, and so its reveal was kind of like blah. I didn't really care. I didn't understand why this was a point of conflict in the book at all, really. And it was a bit of a bummer that they don't actually like get together until the very, very, very end of the book, which is a little bit of a letdown. So, a bit of a mixed bag. And I ended up giving this book 3 stars. I was intrigued enough by this book 3 that I wanted to jump into the next one, because one of the characters that I met in book 3 is who book 4 is about. So I was like, oh, obviously I want to read their romance too. And so the next book that I read was The Infamous Duchess by the same author. I think this series is called the Diamond in the Rough series. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's right. And yeah, so this is book 4 in that series. And overall, I liked this one a little bit more than I liked the previous book. And I feel like I liked it more because I loved the two main protagonists. Viola and Henry were chef's kiss. I loved their chemistry. I loved their individual personalities too. Yeah, and Viola is kind of this misunderstood duchess who I think works at the same hospital that Florian from the previous book works at. And Henry is just this like classic, handsome, kind of notorious scoundrel about town. And yeah, like I said, they have such good banter, such good chemistry. Now, the plot and pacing in this one isn't great. It's nothing to write home about. But yeah, what brought this book up for me was the characters. I really liked them. I will say, like the previous book, you do have to wait till the very end for them to like get together. And it was a little underwhelming, and it wasn't technically a fade to black scene, but it was as close to that as you can get. So if you've read it, you know what I mean. But yeah, it was a little bit of a disappointment, but I still had fun. Also, the beginning, like 2/3, they have such funny, flirty back and forth. And then kind of the last third where they declare their love for each other, it kind of gets boring. Like their back and forth becomes more like swoony and I love you. And I just found that a little less interesting. So, again, a bit of a mixed bag. Overall, this series, or the part of it that I read, was like nothing extraordinary, but it was a good enough time. I gave the second book a 3.5 stars. Next, I read Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. And this was one of our book club books for the book club I'm in with my sisters and family friends called Broads Who Book. And this was my pick, and I have officially redeemed myself from my pick last year, which was everyone's least favorite book. This one overall was much, much, much better, much more well received. Yeah, I gave myself a little pat on the back for this one. I mean, in general, Taylor Jenkins Reid is one of my favorite authors. I give 4.5 or 5 stars to almost all of her books. I just love her world building. I love her character development. I love that she creates these really complex characters that feel so real. Like I constantly have to remember that they're fictional characters and that I can't look them up on, Google or IMDb or whatever. So yeah, no one is surprised that I loved Carrie Soto is Back. I gave it 5 stars, like a raise the roof kind of 5 stars. I loved it. I was completely captivated the whole time. And I know nothing about tennis, and I knew nothing about tennis going into this. And who knew I was gonna care so deeply about tennis? I was so invested in her career. I was really interested in all the nuances of the practicing and the jargon, and it was so fascinating. And I was just so invested in Carrie Soto's life. I thought she had such an interesting relationship with her father. I thought, the tennis world stuff was really, just very compelling. I was completely wrapped up in it, and I blazed through this book. My only complaint is, and my mom brought this up at our book club, is I almost wish the book was a little bit longer. Like the ending, I'm very content and pleased with how things ended, but I wish we got like an epilogue or like a few more chapters to kind of close out where it ends. I think I would have liked that. Overall, this is an incredibly gripping story about family, legacy, overcoming adversity, and like so much more. I really highly recommend it. And you certainly don't have to read any of the other books, but in classic Taylor Jenkins Reid fashion, it's fun because you get cameos of other characters through here. So yeah, overall, loved it. 10 out of 10 would recommend. All right, next I read The Elf Tangent. Again, I have no idea who it's by. You'll see it on the screen. And this is another one from my forever long list of backlisted fantasy romance that I casually want to get to. And this was fine. This was perfectly middle of the road. I gave it 3 stars. This one is a standalone, so that's kind of nice that you don't have companion series or books, or it's not part of a longer series. You follow this really nerdy economics mathematician princess from a poor kingdom. Her name is Aldari, I think. I kind of forgot. And yeah, she gets kidnapped by these elves on the way to her arranged marriage. And she gets kidnapped because this like main elf guy thinks that she is the one who can solve this big mystery puzzle thing that can break a curse for the elves and their kingdom. And you know, as Aldari gets to know her kidnapper, Hawk, romance ensues, as it should. The thing about this book that bothered me a little bit is it's got this setting of a very typical like history, back in the past, fantasy, you know, setting, but the characters use very modern language. Like there's characters who will say like, shut up, or I'll pass. Like there's one quote, and I'll tell you directly, one of the characters asks somebody, do elves have servants to scrub their butts? Like, in what, you know, 16th century setting would anyone say this? Yeah, it took me out of the story a little bit because I didn't feel like the conversation stuff fit for the setting. So I don't know, that might not bother everybody, but it drove me a little nuts. Also, like this book, there were twists, but they didn't surprise me. Like nothing about this book caught me off guard. All of the reveals felt very much like, yeah, Noda. Plus this like weird math mystery thing that she was like trying to solve. It got so into the weeds of mathy stuff that like as I was listening, my eyes would like glaze over and I was like, I don't understand what you're even talking about anymore. I just like didn't care all that much. And all that to say is I did have a fun time listening to this. It was a perfect before bed listen. It was light, it was a bit predictable, nothing new or surprising or groundbreaking, but it was still really fun to read or to listen to. You know, take it or leave it. Then we got to my one DNF of the month. That was Highland Conquest. And I DNF'd this pretty early at like 15%. Now, I am a sucker for a Highland setting, a Scottish narrator, but there was way too much sexism in this book for me. And it was not helped at all by having a male audiobook narrator. It just made it feel ickier. And it's such a bummer. And maybe if I continued reading, I'd feel differently. But you know, the first 15%, I feel like there are the bones there for a really like complex, badass female protagonist. But instead, especially or at the beginning, she's really made off to seem like frivolous and stupid and ridiculous. And the male characters are just so patronizing. I hated it. It's not what I'm in the mood for. And even if it got better, I just didn't want to put myself through that. So I DNF'd it. The next book that I read was A Counterfeit Heart by Kate Bateman. And this is part of a series, but this is just the only book from that series that's available on audio, which is a bummer. I'm gonna have to get the Kindle versions or like buy the books physically because I had a great time with this. I gave it 4 stars. Kate Bateman to me is one of my favorite historical romance authors, and this one did not disappoint. Now, this one, I think this book is book 3 in the series, and this one felt perfectly fine as a standalone. Like I didn't feel like I was missing any additional information or context or characters. So for this series, I don't think you need to necessarily read them in order. I felt like I knew everything that was going on like from page 1. So this story follows Sabine, who is this French counterfeit artist, and she forges banknotes, and she's just this international criminal. And Richard, who is this Viscount, I think, but he's low-key a secret spy agent thing for the crown. Some stuff comes up and they have to work together to do some stuff, discover and uncover a bigger baddie, and it was so much fun. I was intrigued from page 1. I thought they had excellent chemistry. And yeah, this book really helped me get out of my slumpy mood. After that DNF, I was like, do I ever read again? I don't know. And this book pulled me right back in. Although I thought Richard was a bit pompous and arrogant, he had some real moments of humor and charm. So he felt like a pretty balanced hero. And Sabine was just effortlessly likable. She was so chic and clever. I loved her. The steamy scenes were also top tier. I mean, I love the way Kate Bateman writes like smuttier scenes, and I loved it in this book too. Overall, I love this. Like I said, I'm gonna have to read the whole series now because I loved every minute of it. I can't remember if I said this at the beginning, but I gave it 4 stars, but like maybe 4.5. I don't know. It was great. All right, the next book that I read was called The Bad Muslim Discount, and this was a book club This was a book club pick for the book club that I'm in at work with some of my colleagues, and I knew nothing about what this book was going to be about. I went into it completely blind, and long story short, I loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars. This book follows these 2 main characters as they kind of journey through life. And, you know, of course their paths cross, but it's about so much more than that. This story is all about family, religion, prejudice, trauma, love, healing, connection. Like, it is a really beautifully written story. I was completely captivated from page 1. I love how this author wrote these characters. They feel perfectly imperfect and distinct and just authentic. They just felt like such real people that I could meet in real life. Also, the side characters in this book give it a lot of depth. Some of the side characters were like my favorite characters, like the main guy, his dad, I loved. There was this like landlord character who I adored. Yeah, it was just, there were so many really interesting characters. I also really appreciate that this novel highlights all the different ways that people think about and practice religion, like even within the same family, the same community, and really explores how that can both create tension between people and connection. I just felt like that was so real because, you know, no one religion is that simple and everybody has different views and practices around that. And so I loved that this book kind of highlighted that for Islam. My only complaint about this book is that the elements of romance felt quite underdeveloped, especially as like an avid romance reader. Like, that left a lot to be desired. But because that's not like the main plot at all within this story, it didn't take away from my overall kind of obsession and enjoyment of this book. So this was something that was totally off the radar for me. I had never heard of it, never heard of the author, and I loved it. I loved it so much. I think if you have not even heard of it, pick it up. It was such a pleasant surprise. I can't recommend it enough. It was great. 4.5 stars. I can't remember if I said that. Now, coming off such a high, I then had the unfortunate experience of reading What Lies Beyond the Veil. And I don't know how I finished this book. I gave it a 1 star. I low-key might hate this book more than I hated The Cruel Prince. That's bold, but I think it might be true. This book, to me, felt like the main love relationship was an abusive relationship. And I felt like I was watching or reading this unhealthy, toxic relationship being romanticized. And it 100% is not romantic. It felt so off. I really didn't care for it. Also, the love interest calls her little one, which is so off-putting because that's what you call children, not your sexual, romantic, adult partner. It was just a major yuck. And I know we are in the main character's head, we're in her perspective. So we hear her thoughts around her curiosity and her sort of consent, but he's not in her mind. He doesn't hear those thoughts. And there's times where she's verbalizing no, and he whips out his dick and says some really sexually explicit stuff. Yeah, it was such a no for me. I really didn't like it. I would never recommend this to anyone ever. And also, the plot was really predictable. I didn't like any of the characters. The world building didn't feel new or interesting at all. I hated this so much. So you might be wondering, Andy, why didn't you DNF this? There were 2 things that like kept my intrigue just enough to keep reading. One of them was I was mildly curious to see if our female protagonist ended up having some kind of like cool, big magical abilities. And spoiler alert, she doesn't, or at least not at the end of book 1. And 2, I wanted to see if her brother was like still alive and if he was gonna show up and save the day or like come back in a meaningful way. And that also didn't happen by the end of book 1. So like, yes, this is a series, but I absolutely will not be continuing. This is my public service announcement to the world. Don't read this book. It was god awful. And if you liked it, maybe in the comments below, like let me know what about it resonated with you or what you liked, or maybe I'm misinterpreting things. I would be really curious. If you have read it and you liked it, I would be curious to know how. Anyways, moving on. Then I read Cirque Berzerk, which was the only book that I successfully completed for Black Aweenathon. I just was not in a spooky mood during October, and I was really feeling slumpy, and so I was hesitant to make myself read things that didn't like initially spark a lot of interest because I just did not want to put myself in a reading slump. So all that to say is I did not read, as you can already tell, I didn't read a lot of spooky books in October, but you know what, for me, that's pretty on brand. Now, despite the odds of me feeling slumpy, not really liking horror spooky books, and this book I had to physically read, I loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars. This little horror novella slasher thing was amazing. It was amazing. The pacing was so gripping. The tone was really unexpected. There's a lot of like dark humor. It added such, I don't know, it just had such a unique vibe. I was not expecting it. Yeah, I was just so into this like retro, cheesy, campy, and like darkly funny atmosphere. There was also a plot twist in the second act that I absolutely did not see coming, and I loved it. It was fun. There was a lot of references to like 80s music. I often would play the song in the scene to like really put myself into the novella, into the book, and it really upped my enjoyment. I thought it really brought this story to life even more. Oh my God, it was so fun. I would say even if slashers are not your jam, read this. It doesn't have to be Halloween. It was so good. It was so unexpected. I had an absolute blast, and I read it Halloween weekend. It was so fun. I loved it so much. What a pleasant surprise. Now I'm like, I have to read more from this author, from Jessica Guess. And do I like slashers? I don't know, maybe. The second to last book that I read was called Bewitching a Highlander. And again, I liked this. I gave it 3.5 stars. This was kind of exactly what I wanted, expected, and needed it to be. The main character, Brina, she is a healer from some place, I think maybe from Isle of Skye, and she has like a little touch of witchiness going on for her. And she embarks on this journey to find her dad. And during this journey, she bumps into this guy, Egan, and for reasons, he decides to help her on this quest. This story was a bit cheesy, a bit predictable, a bit steamy, and very Scottish. I wish the author went into her magical abilities. Like, I wish she did more with that. But yeah, overall, I liked their chemistry. It was really fun. It was really light. I had a good time. I had a grand old time listening to this. The last book that I read in October was The Black Witch by Laurie Forrest. And I had some stuff come up in my personal life, and so I was really craving like something that was like a reread, like something that was familiar enough that I wasn't anxious or stressed about what was going to happen, but there was enough distance so that I didn't remember all the ins and outs of the plot. And so I was looking through my Audible library and I saw this book and I was like, oh, I vaguely remember reading that. Like, let's jump back into that one. I think I originally read this book back in 2018, maybe 2019. And at the time, I think it was just this book and maybe the second book. I can't even remember if back then if I'd read the second book. And wow, yeah, I forgot how much I loved this book. And spoiler alert, I have continued on in the series and I love the series. In this book / series, you follow the main character Eleanor as she goes to college, and she comes from a very small town. She's grown up with these really conservative religious ideals, and you kind of follow her as she goes to college, and she like meets all these other different peoples from all these other races, cultures, religions, countries, and you're with her as she is really challenged to question her previously conceived ideas about all these different people. And she's pushed to examine her prejudices and like what is real and what is not real. She's really forced to look at histories from other perspectives. And it's just like, it's a really interesting journey that she goes on. And on top of that, it's a fantasy. So there's like magical shit happening. I think if you can make it through the first like 50%, Ellerin is like really frustrating at that beginning half because she's, you know, coming from this really sheltered religious background to like the big city. And yes, she eventually grows, her mindset shifts, her perspectives change, like thank goodness. So if you can make it to 50% and beyond, it's just like so great. It expands to other conflicts and other situations. In this book and in this series, I think the world building is really interesting. I'm a sucker for elemental magic, and this book has it. My sister was actually telling me that this book sort of reminds her of Shadow and Bone, and I could totally see that comparison. The found family in this series is like one of my favorite components of it. It is absolutely wonderful. I just love this like little band of misfits, how they have to, you know, work together to take on this bigger, badder evil that's out there. It does remind me a little bit of like Harry Potter, like all these kids at school have to like go behind the scenes to fight the big bad that the adults can't seem to figure out how to handle. Overall, it is really, really fun. I highly recommend it. Plus, the final book, I think, in this series comes out sometime next year. So get on it, join the train. It was great. It was a great time. All right. Those are all the books that I read in the month of October. So even though I was feeling quite slumpy, I still did pretty well. I got 11 books under my belt. You know, October was a pretty mediocre month of reading for the most part, but I did have a couple favorites. I loved The Bad Muslim Discount. I loved Carrie Soto is Back. Loved the Kate Bateman book, but that was like not all that much of a surprise. And I sort of fell in love with this Black Witch series. So even though there were some lows, there were also some pretty nice highs. Please feel free to leave in the comments down below any of your highlights or lowlights from your October reading month. If you read any of these books, please feel free to leave me your thoughts on any of them down below. I'd love to see if we had similar or different thoughts. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you so much. This is so fun for me, and so I love that I get to share it with this little teeny tiny corner of the web, the interweb. All right, have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, morning, whatever, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.